Hey guys, so we're checking out the waterproofing job that I am currently working on right now for the connectors on my e-bike. So I'm using E6000. This probably isn't as good as, say, something like silicone or like a silicone electrical conformal coating, but this will definitely work better than hot glue would. The problem with E6000 is it is very tough, meaning that when it dries kind of hard. Not hard like plastic, but hard like a very hard rubber. So cutting through it, even with an X-Acto knife, it's much harder to do than something as soft as silicone. So any disassembly work is going to be a little bit more of a pain in the ass if you ever have to do, but it is removable. A lot like hot glue, this stuff, since it does dry harder, it rips more similar to hot glue, but it's not as hard as hot glue, if that makes sense. I know that's not very great description, but that's like the closest. It's in between the hardness of silicone and hot glue, but it's much tougher than hot glue, and it's much more malleable and stretchy like rubber and silicone are. So it does a lot better job of actually sealing and keeping a tighter seal on things. So that's why I used that. It was just what I had on hand. I have a couple other things. I even have some silicone actually I could have used, but the only type that I have right now are in a caulk type container, and I didn't even want to mess with that just because it's a bigger, goopier job than this tiny thing requires. So I figured the E6000 application would be a lot easier, and it was. But all right, so we're going on talking about this. I know it looks terrible, and the looks are, well, for me, I could care less what it looks like. The effectiveness is much more important overall over the looks. So starting right here, you can see some heat shrink is on here, right? You see how this wire, this red wire, part of it is black and then it goes to red. Well, that black area, for those who aren't familiar with wiring and stuff like this, that is called heat shrink. And at the edges of the heat shrink, where the heat shrink ends, up here and down here, especially over time and over wiggling and moving wires around, the ends of that heat shrink tend to kind of over time warp outwards. So when you have this tube, the tube is your wire, and then you have a heat shrink that goes over it, but both ends kind of flare outwards. That allows for water to be able to seep into that heat shrink and further into the wiring and the connection. So that's why we did the ends of that. We didn't really worry about covering the entire heat shrink because it's not really necessary. You just want to make sure that you cover completely all the way around, and that's what I mean by completely, all the way around the wire, the ends. Anywhere where there could potentially be an opening to the wiring. And that's why we did around here this plastic, this is called a Dean's connection, and it looks like that. This is the female. The Dean's connector is plastic, and so the actual connector, you don't need to waterproof it, but you do need to waterproof where the heat shrink meets that plastic, because like we said, if that heat shrink over time flares out, that is another opening, a potential opening where water or moisture could seep in. So for the connector, that's all you really need to do. And on any connector, this is universal for any connections and any type of waterproofing. Moving down here, this, yeah, again, it looks terrible, and I'm not worried about how it looks at all. This, we could have went an extra step further and just waterproof and just covered all of this stuff and to where there's no hole right here in between these wiring right here. But that's not really necessary as long as you get it all the way around each wiring up down to the actual plastic casing that it goes into, which we have done here. You can see it's hard to tell, but let's see if we turn this around so you can see in there We got it all the way down, all the way around, which is all we really need to do. Um, and we went an extra step further, down along this area here on both sides. If you turn this around and you hold it in the light, you can see some cracks where it's not completely airtight there, or it doesn't actually sit flush. So what we did was we went around that back side with the E6000 as well, so that no water could potentially seep through that area as well. Now, the problem with, here's the other part that we waterproofed. We waterproofed around this black connector that meets the actual XT60 yellow connector, in case any water could seep through there, as well as down here where the wires go into this black part of the connector. And then this is the part that I was actually surprised about. These areas in here where you see the solder job they didn't have any type of waterproofing over them. They were just exposed. I would think on any type of electrical vehicle, it doesn't have to be a motorcycle, it doesn't have to be a car, just anything that is intended for transportation, which any of these EVs, electric vehicles, one wheel, a scooter, a bicycle, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. Essentially, those were designed to be a vehicle, a way of transportation. And if you're like me, which most people are in this sense, you need to be able to rely on your transportation. And so if they're not properly addressing certain things in the build, it could potentially be a hazard, safety hazard in the future. And so that's the thing that I wanted to say about this particular part in this. I'm very surprised that they did not even just put some, on the battery, they didn't really waterproof it either, but they did at least take the liberty of putting some hot glue on it. And so they could have at least did that. At least it would be something. And as long as you coated the entire solder joint, it would be waterproof until where the hot glue meets the surface finally breaks loose, and then you have that crack there, right? That's how hot glue works. You can use it to waterproof stuff, but since it is not as flexible or rubbery, it tends to break apart, especially if a surface is very smooth and slick. It doesn't have a very good attachment over time. It tends to break loose pretty easily. Hot glue does. Doesn't matter what kind you get. Well, actually, I can't say that because I'm not a hot glue expert. But as far as your most generic and most widely used hot glues, even stuff like this that is probably the same stuff that you would use for some types of flooring applications. Yes, they have hot glue for flooring applications. Anyways, I digress. What I'm saying is, I'm just surprised at the lack of precautions they took to some of the electrical work on this, seeing as how this is an electric vehicle and it could potentially be out in the rain, or if it's your only way of transportation. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes it's snowing, sometimes it's raining, and you just have to go. And you don't have money for an Uber, or you don't have the luxury of having a lot of really great friends and family that are open to helping you out with those kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a lot to say. But so basically, we did some waterproofing on all of those connections that we could get to without taking this out. And I'm probably going to have to do that anyways, just because it's better safe than sorry. And if you don't have time to do it right, when do you have time to do it over again? So yeah, just talking about waterproofing and discussing a little bit about this e-bike. This is the Ingwe Engine Pro 750 watt e-bike. I do recommend this e-bike, but there are some warnings, nothing that is going to, at least to me, make you ever regret buying it. But at the same time, I think that somebody getting an electric vehicle, if you're needing it for if it's the only transportation you have to rely on, I would honestly recommend waiting and saving up until you can afford two different, of course, buying two different $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 bikes is probably not realistic for most people. But like, even if you had, like, say you only have 5 or 10 miles to go to rely, you know what I mean, that you need it for back and forth for work, and then maybe some necessities and groceries and things like that within 10 miles, then get something extra that's a fraction of the price of your main thing, so that anytime you are waiting on parts for it when it is down, because it will happen eventually, because you have to maintain things in order for them to just keep on going and going and going. Otherwise they won't, and they'll just end up in your garage half taken apart for years and years and years. So I would recommend having enough money, say $500 or $600 extra, to get you something that you could use temporarily while your main transportation is down. Because if you only have one and something within a year comes up that needs to be replaced on it 3 to 5 times out of the year, and you bought it from China and you live in the US, it's going to take and you have to ship your unit in, it's going to take at least 1 month. And having to do that, that's 5, if you have to do that 3 to 5 times a year, that's 3 to 5 months. That's a lot of time that you can't afford to take off, or most people can't afford to take off. So that's why I say that. Sorry, this is way too long. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope it was useful. I hope it was knowledgeable. I hope you guys learned something from it, and I hope it was helpful for anyone. Thank you guys for watching.